everybody, it's my great pleasure to introduce Mr. Hugh Whitfield, who is a urologist, a very eminent urologist, and his main focus now is on medico-legal work, medical negligence, and that's what he's going to talk to us about today. There's a lot of links between Hugh and St Mark's, and he got in touch with me when he knew that I'd become president of the St Mark's Association. He was a consultant urologist at Barts at the time when St Mark's was at City Road, and he was the honorary consultant urologist to St Mark's at that point, and that's how he developed a link. And we were just chatting about the fact that he also spent some time working as a consultant urologist at Central Middlesex. So lots of connections there, which is why he reached out to us and offered to share his thoughts about medical litigation in the UK. So over to you, Hugh.
Well, thank you very much, Sue, and for the invitation, which was rather foisted on you, because I do find that medical litigation now is my main focus. But I look back and remember very happily the times that I spent working at St Mark's and learning from colleagues at St Mark's. And nowadays, I think that my clinical work has diminished to almost non-existent, particularly after COVID, but the medical litigation still holds up. And the more I see of it, the more concerned I become, because I have seen quite significant changes. Now, Pooja is going to change the slides when I ask her to, so we could have the next one, please. And I wanted just to quickly make a declaration of interest, because I do have a company. You could look at that website if you wanted to, but it's actually a complete failure as a company. It has made no money. It's cost a lot of money to try and get it going, but it was designed to try to further the initiative from NHS Litigation Authority when they changed their minds and promote mediation. I haven't given up on that as a philosophy, as we will see later on. Next slide, please. It's just worth stopping and saying and asking ourselves, why did it change its name? And it did so 5 years ago. And the reason for it was that they had made a decision that they needed to try to circumvent the complicated, expensive and lengthy litigation process that was pursued at that time. And so it was much more than just a cosmetic change. But the problem is that though they have introduced mediation, it is introduced far too late in what I call the patient journey. Now, I shall be talking more about the details and the steps in that patient journey towards the end. But NHS Resolution last year, out of the 12,000 odd cases, clinical cases that were brought to their attention, only 299 were resolved through mediation. Now that's better than none, but at the same time it's a drop in the ocean compared to the total number. And we must ask ourselves, why has that occurred? Next slide. I think we've got to try and get our numbers in perspective. We do a vast amount of clinical work in different situations, and the total number of complaints to the NHS last year, in the last 12 months, was just over 12,000. Now, I'm not in any way trying to excuse that and to minimize it, because every case is a tragedy for the individual. And I think that we must try to find ways in which we can address the numbers of those. We can't address the numbers of consultations and A&E attendances every month, but we can, I think, find ways to reduce the number of concerned patients who bring their concerns through the lawyers to NHS Resolution. Next slide, please. We have to do it not only for the sake of the individual patient, but also because the annual costs are enormous. I mean, we can see that over the last 10 years, these costs just on the new cases each year have trebled. And the annual costs, which are the ones that really need to be focused on, include the money that is being paid out annually from previous claims. And that has now reached £10 billion a year, which is a very sizable chunk out of the total NHS budget. And it compares badly to almost all other countries. But the most alarming figure of it all is that the provision for malpractice has increased annually and is now 83 billion. And if we go to the next slide, we can see that in the same length of time during which the costs have trebled, the annual costs, the numbers have not trebled, because in 2011-12 there were just over 9,000 and now there are 12,000. We have to remember that that 12,000 plus there includes for the first time GPs, because up until about nearly 2 years ago, medical litigation in primary care was handled by the private indemnity companies, and now it's been taken over by NHSR. But 12,000 cases is a considerable number, and we must look and see where those cases come from. Next, please. The costs, of course, are divided between not just the claimants, but between the claimants and lawyers. The lawyers now account for about a quarter of the total, or rather more, but the more concerning thing for me is that the claimant legal costs are so much more than the defendants. Why should that be? There are good reasons why, and the NHSR doesn't really understand them. And I'll just give you one example. In the last 5 years, what I have found is that many of the smaller legal companies, solicitors, don't want to have to fund the cases for the length of time that they take to travel through the patient journey, and so they ask agencies to do it. Now, the biggest agency is somebody called Premix, and nobody knows, let alone NHSR, because I've asked them, how much they add to the total costs of the claimant's legal bill. But it's a very significant amount. I mean, if you and I were going to be funding a solicitor for, let's say, 4 years, we would be adding at least, I would have thought, 25 and perhaps 50% to the total costs, just as a sort of way of making money ourselves. And there are about 20 of these companies that I deal with, and that has been a change over the last few years. But it's a contribution to the costs that the NHSR can't identify and didn't really realise until I talked to them about it when I had a meeting 2 or 3 years ago with the Chief Executive, Helen Vernon. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So NHS Resolution is a strange organisation. It has 300 people working for it, but I asked under the Freedom of Information Act, I'm actually an awful nuisance to them because I keep asking them questions under that act, and they had no doctors in 2015, and they have just answered my most recent request, and they've got none now. They may have a few, they think, but they are not there in their medical capacity. And we can compare that, for example, with the Medical Protection Society, with whom their president is Dame Jane Dacre, their chairman is Ian Erdley, who was the vice president of the College of Surgeons, and they have a medical director, Rob Henry, and 40 other doctors. So why is it that the MPS feel it is necessary to have a medical input, as do the MDU, and yet the NHS Resolution don't? And I think actually we only have to look at the BMJ article that was written by the future president, David Oliver of the Royal College of Physicians, when a couple of weeks ago in the BMJ, he said how to improve doctors' influence. Well, I think that's one of the things that we've got to do when we talk about how we can cope with medical litigation and reduce it. Next slide, please. Now, I hope you can see some of this. I know it's a rather complicated graph, and I don't want to dwell on it more than to look at the left-hand one, and at 3 o'clock you can see 11%, and then turn your attention to the pie chart on the right, and you see in the same color 59%, and we are not surprised to see that that is the costs of the obstetrics, and 60% of all the costs of litigation are now for the obstetric cases that we have learned so much about during since the Ockenden report. If we turn our attention back to the left-hand one, we can just see at about 7 o'clock a green 3%, which is urology, and I've been looking at those figures particularly. There isn't any part of that chart that includes just colorectal surgery. It's lumped in with general surgery, which I'm sure is not what you would wish, but that's how it is. But nevertheless, general surgery is total 8%, and the costs of that 8% are 2% of the total. So next slide, please. This is another chart which I want to just try to simplify by looking at the bar chart part, the second from the left. And what we can see there in the lighter blue is that nearly 40% of the cases that come to NHSR are settled but without any proceedings and without any compensation. Now that is of concern for reasons that I'll try and clarify in a minute. Even when there are proceedings, a significant number, and that blue chart on the far right of the bar charts shows that a number of them don't get any compensation there either. And even when they go to trial, and less than 1% of cases go to trial, there are 38 out of the 56 cases where the claimant received no compensation. Now, how can that be? These cases have dragged on through the courts with all the expense for years and years. Next slide, please. And the reason is that actually they're being wrongly advised by lawyers, and I'll talk about that a bit more. I was mentioning how I think we have to have more input from doctors, and it was a disappointment to me that when the House of Commons Select Committee had their consultation on costs, which finished earlier this year, of the written submissions, there was only one from one of the Royal Medical Colleges. And it was even more of a disappointment that at the 3 meetings, when they had a total of 18 witnesses, there was not one single UK doctor. There were 2 from abroad, one from Japan and one from Sweden, if I remember rightly. And so we are losing influence as the medical profession in how medical litigation is handled. Next slide, please. So what can we do? Well, I think there's quite a lot we can do. And we have to understand where we are going wrong. Next slide, please, because we are. We have to understand also that medical litigation is a business. It's a industry. It's a dirty industry in some respects, because I think that the integrity that I have encountered leaves a very distasteful impression at the end of the journey. So, of course, it's not just the lawyers who are using this as an industry. There are people like me too, who are making quite a good living, having retired from the NHS, as medical experts. So I can't exonerate doctors entirely. Next slide, please. But we see in our emails these sort of unpleasant adverts where firms will offer concerned patients the opportunity to get money when actually we know that in a third of the cases they won't. Next slide. And they are pretty distasteful. And if you really think you can judge whether or not medical negligence has occurred by taking a 10-second claim test, then I think that we've reached a nadir. Next slide. Lawyers are out on a fishing expedition. They know that if they trawl sufficiently hard, they will be able to pick up some cases where they can prove that there has been an event that can be classified as medical negligence. Next slide. But if you are a lawyer, and you can think of it in horse racing terms, if you know you're going to win 2 out of 3, then you're pretty happy, because you can mitigate your costs in the other third as well by getting something called after the event insurance, which is available at low cost and is often actually funded by the claimant themselves. So it is a lucrative business. Next slide, please. And we have to remember also that it is civil litigation, and therefore the burden of proof is only on the balance of probabilities. But even so, when it's only on the balance of probabilities, they get it wrong in 1/3 of the cases. Next slide, please. So what can we do? Well, I had the opportunity to conduct a survey with 2 medical students, and I would like to advertise and just tell you briefly about that survey. Next slide, please, which was published in a medico-legal journal and which is available. I have got this reference on the last slide, so you don't need to copy it down. Next slide. There were 10 questions on SurveyMonkey, and I just want to draw your attention to the results of 2 of the questions. When the moment you stop being a medical student and you become a foundation doctor, you realize that you don't know enough about medical litigation. And that was a very sobering fact, but even more concerning to my mind was the fact that most of them didn't understand the term Crown indemnity. So somewhere along the line, there has to be more input from medical school, but trying to get that as part of a curriculum is like trying to run through treacle. I have done a survey of all the UK medical schools twice, and less than 2 or 3% actually do feel it's an important part of the curriculum, and in those cases the lectures are given not by a doctor but by a lawyer. Next slide, please. So we're losing track. We need to let the medical students know that their risk is going to vary depending on which specialty they choose. An orthopedic surgeon colleague of mine said that there's been an estimate that let me get it right, that all orthopedic surgeons reckon to have an investigation every 3 years, and that 50% of them find that the chance of a GMC investigation. If they decide to become an obstetrician, well, we can all guess the risk in that specialty, but every specialty has its own risk profile. Next slide, please. And I looked at the claims in urology over the last 10 years, and I don't want to focus on the individual numbers, but what we can see disappointingly in urology is that the total number of claims over 10 years has more than doubled, and apart from the very last year, but also it bears out what I was saying before, that the number of unsuccessful claims has remained steadily at about 1/3. Next slide, please. I've done, under the Freedom of Information Act, asked for the information from all these 5 specialties, and I'm in the process of analysing it to see if there are common factors that we can learn from, and there are. Next slide, please. We are all making mistakes all the time. Next slide. I just keep pressing it, please. And the kind of irritating and stupid things that I tell you lawyers love, because if they find no actual negligence in the medical treatment, if they can find negligence in the consenting process or the records, then they'll go for us in that way as well. But we are making mistakes, and in the urology analysis, I reckoned that at least 1/3 and possibly up to 1/2 of the mistakes that were made could and should have been avoided, leaving JJ stents in for too long, for example. Next slide, please. So what can we do? Well, we've got to try to avoid the mistakes, of course, but we also have to realize that at the moment, when the patient goes to the PAL system, the patient advisory and liaison system that was set up, they are likely to get a poor deal because the shutters come down. People think, gosh, they're going to be finding a lawyer around their necks in 5 minutes, and the only option then for a concerned patient is to go to a lawyer. Next slide, please. And so we must find ways to approach a concerned patient that avoids those scenarios. And we must follow the basic rules and remember that what the lawyers will tell you is if it isn't written down, it didn't happen. And that is something which we have to remember, and we have to write down negative findings. There was no abdominal tenderness. rather than just there was abdominal tenderness. And I've been in cases where lawyers have made hay on the back of the absence of negative findings. Next slide, please. So what can we do? Well, we've got to understand where they're coming from. We have to understand that it's a business, and we have to try and educate them if that's at all possible. Well, we have to understand what they don't know, or they perhaps choose to forget. Next slide. I read this sentence in a letter from a solicitor, a very good solicitor from a high-profile respectable firm, but nevertheless it does give an insight into the way in which legal thinking and medical thinking differ. Because if we were to think about that or say something like that about a doctor, we would all be appalled. But that's what this particular lawyer said, wrote. Next slide, please. And we have to understand that. And there was a very famous urologist called Richard Turner Warwick, who used to say that Humpty Dumpty, he used to quote Humpty Dumpty all the time. And lawyers will use words, they will twist words, and I think that we have to try to be as clear when we're writing reports and clear in writing our clinical notes as we possibly can be. Next slide, please. We all know about evidence. Whether lawyers do as well, I'm not sure. If they do, they disguise it. We all know that the opinion of an expert rates very poorly. We know that case reports don't figure very highly in the hierarchy. But of course, much of the legislation that supports medical litigation in terms of consent is based on individual cases like Bolam, Belitho, Montgomery, Afshar. All of these ones will be quoted ad infinitum, and it's interesting that it has taken often appearances at 3 levels of court proceedings before the final decision is made. So any thought that lawyers get it right first time can be abandoned. Next slide, please. And lawyers don't understand clinical practice. There's no reason why they should, except that they are making a judgment on clinical practice. Because what happens was, having got all the medical reports through from both the experts instructed by the claimant and experts instructed by lawyers for the defendants, there will be a cozy cabal, and lawyers from each side will make the decision whether or not there is to be compensation. Medical input at that stage has been long since past. And we also have to remember that the use and abuse of evidence is continuing throughout the process, because, next slide, please. What we've said that already. So next slide. I want to talk about the patient journey, because I'm going to leave time, if we can, at the end to ask for questions. But the patient journey includes, next slide, please, the actual 17 steps. We've got the first 8 of them there. And what I would like to draw your attention to is the number 6 and 7, because counsel, the barrister, will draw up a particular claim on the basis of an expert report. Now, that assumes they understand the medical report, which sometimes they do, but sometimes they don't. And I am sometimes asked to look at the particulars of claim that are going to be sent in, but very often I am not. And so the barrister is able to either cherry pick from my expert report or actually misrepresent it. And that is a concern if particulars of claim are being put together on the basis of my report without my being able to have any input as to the accuracy of those particulars of claim. Next slide. And so it goes on. It goes all the way up to NHSR with reports from the claimants, and then it all goes all the way back down again with medical experts that have been instructed by the defendant. The RTD, roundtable discussion, is what I was talking about just now, where lawyers get together in a cozy cabal, and the way in which this protracted journey occurs is the reason why it takes so long and is so expensive. And the vast majority of cases are settled out of court, and the decision on medical litigation success or failure is made by lawyers, and the expert's opinion is there, and it is the judgment is made on the strength of those reports as decided by the barristers and solicitors for each side, the claimant and the defendant. Next slide, please. What we can do and should aim for is that we have in place a way to circumvent that long protracted process. And about just over a year ago, there was a very good webinar by the Royal College of Surgeons talking about first responder. Now, Keith Turner happens to be another urologist down in Bournemouth, gave an excellent presentation, and he talked about an RCT that they are doing. And what we need to do is to work together to try to find people who are offering this sort of philosophy. And mediation should be and could be introduced at the beginning of the patient journey and not at the end, because entrenched positions have been established if you don't introduce or offer mediation until the end of that patient journey, which is what happens at the moment. And it needs to be introduced at the beginning, but of course, if that were to occur, then the people who would be least happy are the lawyers. But I believe very firmly, as having trained as a mediator, that this is the way forward. There is the potential. That's all right, we can go on to the next one. So I think that was just a summary, because I think one of the other concerns about the effect of medical litigation is that we are all looking over our shoulder, because we hear of cases where colleagues have been dragged through the mill, and it doesn't really matter whether or not the claim is successful, the stress is still immense. And I think that that leads to the defensive and risk-averse medicine and to low morale as well. Next slide, please. So there are different agencies who are trying to reduce mistakes, and we've got to work together. The Royal Medical Colleges have got to work with people like the National Director of Patient Safety, and we have other agencies, the Early Notification Scheme, for example, in obstetrics. But at the moment, we're compartmentalized. And I think that this is not the way that we can actually further the objective to make the patient journey shorter and more effective, so that patients who are harmed get rapid closure and can move on with their lives. Next slide, please. We are the most regulated profession of all. But actually, whatever we're told to do in terms of ethics, we've been being told for 2,000 years, and our ethical standards are just taken for granted. And it may sound rather pompous, but I'm afraid that when I have come across the legal profession, I've even had a barrister say that they don't know that there is any ethical standard of behavior in the legal profession. Now, that's not what I said, that's what he said. Next slide, please. And I want to just end with a little bit of philosophy, because I think when I see how lawyers behave, I think, well, really there is the universal truth, the golden rule, and we must do to others as we would have people do to us or to our loved ones. And this may sound a bit sanctimonious, and if it does, then I'm tempted to apologize, but I'm not sure that I really want to, because I believe that it does underpin what we as doctors are trying to do all the time. Next slide. These are the references which have supported some of the things that I have been saying, and I would draw your attention also to the short report, Legal and Ethical Implications, which bears some relevance to what I have just been talking about ethics. And lastly, what I think we must try to do, next slide, is to avoid any doctor ever having to endure the kind of events that led to the conviction of medical manslaughter for this brave doctor. I'd happily answer any questions.
Thank you, Hugh, for that extremely informative and thought-provoking talk. Can I just ask everybody to just unmute and thank you in the usual way, and please put your questions on the chat. While we're waiting for questions, I think we're up to about 40 people now. I will just kick off with one. We're often told that there is some kind of utopia in New Zealand with their no-fault compensation scheme, about which I know absolutely nothing, and I suspect most people in the audience know nothing. Is that, or is there anything else currently in the world anywhere near your utopia, and something that can be used as a sort of model for us?
Well, that's a very good question, Sue. And there are people who would advocate the New Zealand system, but there's one person I know very well, the former Bishop of London, Richard Charteris, who knows a bit about it because he sat on some committee, and he condemns it. Now, he condemns it because it does deprive the individual of any chance of going forward with litigation if their claim isn't accepted. What they're trying to do in New Zealand, and indeed are doing, I believe, is that they are not looking for fault. They're looking for what damage has occurred before they then offer compensation. And there are other countries that are doing the same. But the critics of the New Zealand system, of whom there are a number, would say, OK, it may save some money and it may shorten the period of what we call the patient journey, but it also at the same time deprives them of some opportunity to pursue litigation if they are not happy with the outcome of their investigation. So it is not regarded by some as being the be-all and end-all and the answer. The system in Australia is interesting and perhaps different, but it is run by doctors and it's independent. And one of the things that I think we have to introduce in this country is to make sure that any rapid investigation under, for example, the first responder is done by a doctor independent of the institution where the patient's care was undertaken. That's not difficult to do. In urology, we have a whole series of regional advisors, and we could have one senior person in that who has been elected by their peers and has their ear to the ground. And if there are things going wrong, particularly pockets of things going wrong, they will alert the system quickly. In Canada, concerns are also handled by doctors. So I think we have the worst of all worlds. But if you talk to somebody like the Action Against Medical Accidents, AVMA, they presented to the House of Commons Select Committee and they said, oh, no, we don't want any significant change. And the lawyers don't want it because one of the ways in which they could reduce costs is to have fixed recoverable costs on the low compensation cases. Something that is, for example, a compensation of 20,000 can often attract legal costs 3 times that. And they want to restrict, the law wants to try, well, the government wants to try and restrict that, but the lawyers won't allow it.
So I've got a question from Phil Tozer, who's one of my colleagues. Phil, do you want to unmute and speak in the old-fashioned way?
Thanks very much. But that was a brilliant talk. Really interesting and useful, I think. So I'm a new consultant in my first 5 years of practice, and so I see this stretching out before me. I went to an ACPGBI meeting a few years ago at which someone called Olive Lewin, a solicitor, was presenting. She works for Lee & Day Solicitors. She was presenting at a surgical meeting and explaining the enormous pleasure she gets from taking money from doctors. And she said, you know, that one of her phrases that's always stuck with me, she said, when you sue someone for doing something, you can only essentially get the value of their house. Now, this is, of course, not actually true, but it's the phrase that she used. But if you could get the person who referred them, then, of course, you can double the amount of money you can get. Now, again, I'm sure this is an entirely untrue way to think about it, but it demonstrated for me the way in which lawyers are approaching this kind of problem. And you've highlighted it fantastically in your talk.
Thank you.
We are in an age right now where unethical behaviour is something that can be drawn to the attention of the world and will get punished roundly by the court of public opinion. And I just wonder whether there is any mileage in us as what is a very ethical profession, identifying and pointing out the very poorly ethical behaviour that lawyers undertake.
Well, I would be more concerned that they would sue me if I did, but sue me for the cost of my house. I think what we've got to do as a profession is work together. I want to try to get a forum of all presidents of all Royal Medical Colleges to work together with those institutions within the NHSR, but even the NHSR is called an arm's length body of the NHS. Now, how can you have an arm's length body which is dealing with such an important topic? How many of these arm's length bodies, of which there are 12, have a chairman who is medical? The answer is none. We have lost our influence in government, and that is a sad reflection on the way that the health service is managed. We've got to try and persuade more doctors to undertake make a greater contribution. But of course, we all like doing medicine. And if the system changes, and as it does every 3 or 4 years, then we are without a job.
We have another question. Andy Latchford, if you could unmute and ask your question.
Yeah, again, thank you very much. A really fantastic talk. I'm quite interested in, from your kind of legal perspective, how we as a body should act. So you've really highlighted the importance of medical notes and record keeping, and if it's not written down, it doesn't happen. But we're in an era now where frequently we're expected to perform procedures, do clinics where medical notes aren't available, or are just loose pieces of paper that may or may not make it back to medical files, or have vague, indecipherable electronic systems put in place which we can't really access. And so I'm quite concerned from what you're saying that in actual fact, as a body, that leaves us very exposed, because if it isn't written down, it didn't happen. We're not really able to prove that because of a system, through no fault of our own, actually doesn't allow us to keep proper medical notes. So I was wondering what the legal perspective is from that point of view, and how we should react as a body when these sorts of changes are instituted.
Well, I think you've highlighted a very important concern. What it brings me on to say is, look, during COVID, a lot of patients had their care delayed for obvious reasons. And the person who is going to be vulnerable at the end of the day is not the hospital manager, it is the doctor, because that's how it works. Although these cases are taken out against a trust, there's always a doctor at the end of that. And what I would do would be to write it down, or write a letter both to the chief executive and with a copy to NHSR saying this patient should have had X, Y, and Z by such and such, and due to COVID hasn't had it. Because I think there could be a tsunami of cases arising because of delays to treatment that have occurred through no fault of anybody. I just look at urology. If you go into acute urinary retention and have a catheter for 6 weeks before your TUR, it's a lot better than having a catheter for 6 months, during which time you're going to be much more likely to develop a urinary infection or urosepsis. I mean, I just think it has, you're absolutely right to highlight these concerns where lack of ability to control our information is going to impact adversely on us.
Can I think Andy has also alluded a bit in, I mean, that we've got that issue hugely, but also, and it is very difficult trying to provide a service that is professionally acceptable in a system over which you have absolutely no control. And we all understand that there need to be compromises made, but a lot of decisions seem to be made by non-medical managers with no transparency and no consultation. And I think it makes it very, very difficult, doesn't it, to provide a proper service. But the other problem that we've got, particularly in our trust at the moment, is with recording things. We did have paper notes in the old-fashioned way. They're being destroyed and scanned into a completely unusable, we're presented with a 500-page PDF file that you can look at on an inadequate internet connection. Finding an old operation note in a 500-page PDF is impossible. We are then recording what we do on a variety of different systems, including bits of paper on some days, 3 or 4 different electronic systems, writing letters that may or may not get attached to one of these 3 or 4 different systems. Every time we complain, we're told we're buying it, we're getting an integrated system in 3 or 4 years. We can't do anything about this, the managers, because this, the integrated system is coming. And I personally feel hugely vulnerable. I feel actually to the point where I don't actually think I can practice like this. But we are roundly ignored. But I get from what you're saying that you suggest that we actually, or as a body, write a letter to the chief executive about that, perhaps as well, just underlying the fact that we think this is fundamentally unsafe. That they're not going to do anything about it. But I suppose if and when we run into medico-legal problems because of it, at least we can produce that letter and say, we told you so. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, I think it is exactly what I'm saying, Sue, but it brings to mind another possible thought. If I were a good businessman entrepreneur, what I would do is to have a handheld dictating machine which is attached to a portable printer in my back pocket, and I would go around on ward rounds or in outpatients and dictate into that and have my own system of records, which I would then actually offer to the trust. And if the trust don't want them, then so be it. But at the moment, the integration of different IT systems varies so much from one hospital to another. And I see that with the way in which notes are presented to me. And most of the time, okay, they are now electronic, but they are electronically copies of handwritten notes. I think there are some where there aren't handwritten notes, and I would give as an example of the Cambridge Health Service Trust, from which I have seen very good quality notes, but I know very well that they don't exist in the vast majority of hospitals, and I think this does make doctors very vulnerable.
They've got a system called EPIC, which UCH also has, which is one of the very few systems that actually works. And when our trust tendered or looked for a system, they didn't even look at EPIC because of what it cost. So I stepped down from the committee involved in choosing, because it seemed to me completely insane they weren't even considering the one system that seems to work.
Well, I think you are now, as a College of Physicians, in the fortunate, I mean, I think your current president is brilliant, but you've got somebody who is taking over in September, David Oliver, who writes in the BMJ, and he isn't somebody who will pull his punches, I'm sure. And I think we need strong leadership from the presidents of all our colleges. For example, Catherine Henderson gets fed up if you say, look, why don't we learn from the aviation industry, has safety records, which is second to none. And she will say, but aircraft don't take off if they're understaffed or if their staff have overrun their shift. And so that sort of a comparison is complete bunkum. And we have to listen to people like that, to take their advice. That they are our representatives, and we need to get ourselves together. Another bit of advertising, just before lockdown, I had arranged a big meeting at the Royal Society of Medicine on mediation, with the good and the great coming to talk. I think we ought to try and do another similar meeting and focus it on medical litigation. I had a meeting with Jeremy Hunt the other day, only engineered because my MP happens to be Theresa May, but he was listening. He is very concerned about harm to patients, and he has been ever since he was Minister of Health, Secretary of Health. And so whatever his other activities were or were not over the 6 years he was the Secretary of State, we now need to have him on side, because he is in a powerful position as chair of the Health Select Committee. And of course, we've got Jane Dacre now, who is heading up the manpower, I hesitate to use the phrase, the workforce investigation. And so we've got these leaders, and we must ensure that we feed into them and that their views are heard.
Thank you, Hugh. I think we now need to head off to our X-ray meeting. That was really, really stimulating and really interesting. And